The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. "You're just old news now, Mom." My son's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather, not dismantling 63 years of my life with 8 simple words. I stood in my kitchen, dish towel still damp in my hands, watching him lean against the counter where I'd served him countless midnight snacks, nursed scraped knees, and celebrated every small victory of his childhood. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the linoleum I'd mopped that morning, the same pattern I'd chosen 30 years ago when we first moved into this house, back when we meant something. Old news. The phrase echoed in my mind as I folded the towel with deliberate precision, my hand steady despite the tremor starting somewhere deep in my chest. He was scrolling through his phone now, thumb moving with the rapid indifference of youth, already having dismissed me as thoroughly as yesterday's headlines. "I suppose that's one way to put it," I said quietly, my voice carrying none of the earthquake I felt beneath my ribs. Years of teaching 3rd grade had trained me to speak calmly even when children were cruel, though I'd never imagined needing that skill with my own child at 41 years old. He didn't look up. "Well, it's true, isn't it? You're retired. Dad's gone. What do you even do with your time now?" The question landed like a physical blow, not because of its harshness, but because of its profound misunderstanding of what it means to be alive, to be worthy, to be seen. I thought of my morning routine, the careful watering of the African violets on the windowsill and the way the light caught the dewdrops on the spider plant Dad had given me for our 20th anniversary. I thought of the book club at the library, where we'd spent 2 hours yesterday dissecting the layers of meaning in a novel my son would probably dismiss as boring old people stuff. I thought of the volunteer work at the literacy center, helping adults learn to read, watching their faces light up when the letters finally made sense. But I said none of this. Instead, I watched my son, this stranger wearing my child's face, and felt something fundamental shift inside me, like tectonic plates finding a new position after years of pressure. "You're probably right," I said, surprising us both. "Things do change, don't they?" He finally looked up, perhaps sensing something in my tone he couldn't quite place. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy who used to run to me with every hurt, every joy, and every secret fear. Then his phone buzzed, and the moment passed. "Anyway, I can't stay long. Meeting some friends downtown." He pushed off from the counter with the casual grace of someone who'd never doubted their welcome anywhere. "You'll be fine, right? I mean, you've got your TV shows and whatever." TV shows and whatever. As if 43 years of marriage, 35 years of motherhood, and 63 years of learning how to be human could be reduced to passive entertainment, time killing until the inevitable. I nodded, still folding and refolding that dish towel. "Of course. Drive safely." He was already halfway to the door when he called back, "Oh, and Mom? Maybe think about getting one of those life alert things. You know, just in case." The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through every room of the house. I stood there for a long time after his car pulled away, listening to the familiar sounds of a house settling into evening. The refrigerator hummed its steady tune. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked time with the same reliable rhythm it had kept for decades. Outside, Mrs. Patterson's dog barked at something only he could see. These sounds had always comforted me before. Tonight, they felt like the soundtrack to a life my son considered over, obsolete, worthy only of safety devices and regular check-ins from people who saw me as a responsibility rather than a person. I walked to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed Dad and I had shared for 26 years before his heart gave out 2 winters ago. The indentation where he used to sleep had finally filled in, but sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, I still reached for the warmth that was no longer there. The memory came unbidden, as they often did in these quiet moments. Michael at 7, running through the back door with dirt-stained knees and excitement lighting up his face. "Mom. Mom. I hit the ball. I actually hit it." The pride in his voice had filled me with such fierce joy that I'd dropped everything, the laundry, the dinner prep, the endless list of things that always needed doing, and swept him into my arms, spinning him around until we were both dizzy with laughter. I'd lived for those moments. The school plays where I sat in uncomfortable metal chairs, beaming as he delivered his 3 lines with the gravity of Shakespeare. The science fair projects that took over our dining room table for weeks, resulting in more learning for me than him as I helped research the migration patterns of monarch butterflies. The driving lessons in empty parking lots, my knuckles white on the door handle while he jerked us through stop-and-go traffic, both of us pretending I wasn't terrified of letting him loose on the world. College had been the first real separation, but we'd adapted. Phone calls every Sunday, care packages filled with homemade cookies and hand-knitted scarves. He'd bring friends home for holidays, and I'd cook enough food for a small army, delighting in their young voices filling the house with energy and possibility. Then came Sarah, his college girlfriend turned wife. Sweet Sarah with her perfect smile and carefully managed enthusiasm for family gatherings. She'd been polite, always polite, but there was something calculated in her kindness, like she was following a script for how to handle your boyfriend's mother. The grandchildren had changed everything, though. When Emma was born, Michael had called me from the hospital, his voice thick with tears and wonder. "Mom, she's perfect. She has Dad's nose and your stubborn chin." I'd driven to the hospital still wearing my gardening gloves, desperate to hold this new miracle, this continuation of our story. For a while, it felt like we'd found our way back to each other. Family dinners where Emma would curl up in my lap, listening to stories about her daddy when he was little. Sleepovers where we'd make pancakes in shapes and stay up past bedtime reading fairy tales. Michael would watch us together with something soft in his eyes, and I'd think, this is it. This is what it was all for. But children grow up, and families grow apart in ways that seem gradual until suddenly they're complete. The weekly dinners became monthly, then sporadic. The phone calls grew shorter, filled with the ambient noise of busy lives that had less and less room for grandmothers who'd already raised their children and served their purpose. I tried to ignore the signs at first. The way my calls would go to voicemail more often than not. The birthday cards that arrived a day or two late, clearly hastily purchased rather than carefully chosen. The Christmas visits that grew shorter each year, Michael checking his phone during dinner, and Sarah managing the children's interactions with me like a careful diplomat preventing an international incident. When had I become something to be managed rather than loved? When had my presence shifted from gift to obligation? The phone rang, startling me from my reverie. For a wild moment, I thought it might be Michael calling to apologize, to say he hadn't meant it, that he was tired and stressed, and that those cruel words had slipped out before he could stop them. But it was my sister Joan, her voice warm and familiar across the miles that separated us. "How was your day, sweetheart? Did Michael stop by as planned?" I hesitated, unsure how to package the afternoon's devastation into words that wouldn't alarm her. Joan was 5 years older and had been widowed longer, but she'd never had children. Sometimes I envied her that, the clean simplicity of a life that belonged entirely to herself, accountable to no one's expectations or disappointments. "He came by," I said finally. We talked. Joan had always been able to read the spaces between my words. "What happened?" I told her, my voice steady and factual, as if recounting something I'd read in the newspaper rather than lived in my kitchen an hour ago. When I finished, the silence stretched between us, filled with all the things sisters understand without saying. "Oh, honey," she said finally, and those 2 words carried more comfort than an hour of platitudes would have. "I think I've been fooling myself for a long time," I admitted. "Holding on to something that stopped being real years ago." "Love is never foolish," Joan said gently. "But loving someone doesn't mean accepting cruelty." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my bedroom, not bothering to turn on the lights. Through the window, I could see the house across the street where the Johanssons lived. They were probably my age, maybe a little younger, and I often saw them working in their garden together in the evenings, moving around each other with the easy choreography of a long partnership. Johansson had had a heart attack last spring, and for weeks afterward, I'd watched Mrs. Johansson shuttled between the house and the hospital, her shoulders carrying the weight of sudden aloneness. But they'd weathered it, and now they were back to their evening routines, grateful for time that had almost been cut short. I thought about David, how he'd died believing his son would take care of me, that family meant something solid and lasting. In his final weeks, when the cancer had stolen everything but his essential kindness, he'd squeezed my hand and whispered, "You'll be okay. Michael's a good man." And Michael was a good man, in the abstract sense that mattered to the world beyond our living room. He'd never been arrested, paid his taxes, held down a steady job, or raised children who were polite in public. But goodness, I was learning could exist alongside a profound failure of heart. The house felt different as I moved through it that evening, as if my son's words had shifted the very molecules of the air. I made myself a simple dinner, soup from a can, crackers from a sleeve, and ate standing at the counter, looking out at the bird feeder David had hung from the maple tree. A cardinal landed on the perch, its red feathers brilliant even in the fading light. David had always said cardinals were messengers from people we'd lost, and while I'd never quite believed it, I found comfort in the idea tonight. If it was a message, I hoped it meant I was strong enough for what came next. Because something was coming next. I could feel it building inside me like weather, a storm system gathering pressure and preparing to move. Not revenge, I was too old and too tired for revenge. But something else. Something like clarity. I thought about my will, locked away in the filing cabinet in David's old study. The formal language that divided our life's work between Michael and Emma, assuming that blood relationships guaranteed appreciation, that family love was a renewable resource that couldn't be depleted by neglect or cruelty. How naive that seemed now. How presumptuous to assume that simply because I'd given life, that life would value what I'd sacrificed to nurture it. The idea came to me gradually, not as a flash of inspiration but as a slow recognition of something that had been true for a while. I didn't have to accept this. I didn't have to smile and absorb cruelty because it came wrapped in the familiar package of my son's voice. I didn't have to pretend that being needed was the same as being loved, or that obligation was a sufficient substitute for respect. I had choices. I had power. I had, despite my son's casual dismissal, value that extended far beyond my usefulness to him. The decision crystallized like sugar syrup cooling into candy, solid and sweet and absolutely certain. I would change my will. Not in anger, not as punishment, but as an act of radical self-respect. If I was old news to my son, then perhaps it was time to write new headlines. I called my lawyer's office and left a message on the answering machine, my voice calm and clear in the darkness of my kitchen. "This is Margaret Chen. I'd like to schedule an appointment to review my estate planning. It's not an emergency, but it is important. Please call me at your earliest convenience." Then I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey with honey, the way David had taught me to like it, and sat in the living room where we'd raised our son, where we'd believed we were building something lasting and good. The cardinal was gone from the feeder, but other birds had taken its place. A pair of chickadees worked industriously at the seeds, their small bodies efficient and purposeful. They didn't need anyone's permission to exist and didn't require validation from their offspring to know their worth. I sipped my tea and watched them until full darkness fell, planning the rest of my life with the careful attention I'd once reserved for other people's dreams. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, a combination that somehow managed to be both comforting and intimidating. I sat across from Margaret Westfield. We'd laughed about sharing a first name when David and I had first drawn up our wills 15 years ago, and watched her review the documents that had once seemed so permanent, so final. "These are fairly standard," she said, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she turned pages. "Everything to your son upon your death, with provisions for your granddaughter if something happens to him. Very straightforward." "Yes," I said. That was when things were different. Margaret looked up, her expression professionally neutral but not unkind. She'd been practicing family law for 30 years, she'd probably seen every variation of family dysfunction that existed. What kind of changes did you have in mind? I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head for 3 days, but sitting here now, the words felt both momentous and surprisingly simple. I want to remove my son as the primary beneficiary. I'd like to set up a trust for my granddaughter's education, but the majority of my estate should go to the literacy center where I volunteer. Margaret set down the papers and folded her hands, giving me her full attention. That's certainly you're right, Margaret. These are significant changes, though. Have you discussed this with your son? No, I said, and the word felt like a small victory. This isn't a negotiation. It's a decision. She nodded slowly. I have to ask, is this something you're doing in anger? Family disputes can be resolved in ways that don't require, it's not anger, I interrupted gently. It's clarity. My son has made it very clear that he sees me as a burden, an obligation to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I'm simply choosing to align my legacy with people who see my life as having value. Margaret made notes on a legal pad, her pen moving with practiced efficiency. Tell me about the literacy center. How long have you been involved with them? 3 years, I said, feeling my shoulders straighten as I talked about something that brought me joy. I help adults learn to read. Basic literacy, but also life skills, how to fill out job applications, understand rental agreements, and help their children with homework. Last month, a woman named Rosa read her first complete book. She's 43 and has been hiding her illiteracy her entire adult life. When she finished that book, she cried. So did I. That sounds incredibly meaningful, Margaret said, and I could hear genuine interest in her voice rather than polite professionalism. It is. Every week, I see people discover that they're not stupid, they're not broken, they just needed someone to believe they could learn. No one has ever called me old news there. When I walk in, faces light up. When I had to miss a week because of the flu, they sent me a card signed by 12 people who wanted me to know I was missed. Margaret smiled, the first real smile of our conversation. It sounds like you found your people. I have. And they should benefit from a lifetime of work and saving, not someone who sees my death as a financial windfall rather than a loss to be grieved. We spent the next hour going over details. The trust for Emma would be substantial enough to cover college and graduate school if she chose, but it would be managed by the bank, not her father. The literacy center would receive the house and the remainder of my savings, enough to fund their programs for years. What about personal items? Margaret asked. Family heirlooms, photographs, things with sentimental value? I thought about the jewelry David had given me over the years, the china that had belonged to his mother, and the photo albums documenting Michael's childhood and our family vacations. Emma can have whatever she wants when she's old enough to understand its value. Everything else can be donated. And your son will receive. Nothing, I said, the word settling into the room like a period at the end of a long sentence. He'll receive nothing because he's already made it clear that he considers what I have to offer worthless. Margaret finished making her notes and looked up at me with something like admiration. I'll have the new documents drawn up by Friday. You'll need 2 witnesses for the signing who aren't beneficiaries. The ladies from my book club will be happy to help, I said. They understand the importance of new chapters. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd punished my son, punishment wasn't the point, but because I'd finally stopped pretending that his love was something I could earn through endless self-sacrifice. I'd stopped making myself small to fit into his diminished view of my worth. The afternoon sun felt warm on my face as I walked to my car, and for the first time in months, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow. There were books to read, people to teach, and a life to live that belonged entirely to me. I thought about calling Joan to tell her what I'd done but decided to wait. Some decisions needed time to settle before they were shared, like sediment in still water finding its proper level. Instead, I drove to the library and spent 2 hours in the biography section, reading about women who'd reinvented themselves in their later years. Grandma Moses started her painting career at 78. Laura Ingalls Wilder published her first Little House book at 64. Women who'd refused to accept that their stories were over just because the world considered them past their prime. When I got home, there was a message on my answering machine from Michael. His voice sounded slightly strained, artificially cheerful in the way that meant he was trying to manage me again. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to check in. Sarah thought maybe I was a little abrupt yesterday. You know how I get when I'm stressed about work. Anyway, we were thinking of bringing the kids by this weekend if you're not too busy. Emma's been asking about those cookies you make. Call me back when you get a chance." I listened to the message twice, analyzing the careful construction of each sentence. Not an apology, exactly, but an acknowledgement that he'd crossed some line that required minor repair work. The mention of Sarah suggested she'd been the one to point out his cruelty, to remind him that maintaining relationships required occasional gestures of kindness. I thought about those cookies Emma loved, snickerdoodles that took most of a Saturday to make properly, rolling each ball of dough in cinnamon sugar with the patience that only grandmothers possess. I'd made them countless times over the years, watching Emma's face light up as she ate them still warm from the oven, getting cinnamon sugar on her fingers and my furniture. The old me would have already been planning the grocery trip, mentally reviewing the recipe, and making sure I had enough butter and eggs. The old me would have called back immediately, grateful for any excuse to fill my weekend with the sounds of family, even if that family saw me primarily as a source of baked goods and childcare. But I wasn't the old me anymore. That woman had died in my kitchen 3 days ago, a casualty of 8 casual words delivered without thought or care. In her place stood someone I was still getting to know, someone who understood that love without respect was just another form of exploitation. I deleted the message without calling back. Instead, I called the Literacy Center and volunteered to help with their fundraising dinner next month. "We could really use someone with your organizational skills," Diana, the director, said with obvious pleasure. "And if you're willing, we'd love to have you speak about your volunteer experience. Donors love hearing directly from our tutors." "I'd be honored," I said, and meant it. When was the last time anyone had asked me to speak about something I cared about? When had anyone last valued my skills rather than just my services? That evening, I sat in David's study and looked through the photo albums I'd so carefully maintained over the years. Pictures of Michael's childhood, his wedding, Emma's first steps, and family vacations where we'd all smiled for the camera and pretended we were as happy as we looked. But there were other pictures too, ones I'd forgotten about. Me at my college graduation, 22 years old and glowing with possibility. David and I on our honeymoon, young and ridiculous with love. Pictures from my teaching years, surrounded by gap-toothed second graders who'd made me cards and brought me wilted dandelions. I'd had a life before I became Michael's mother. I'd had dreams and ambitions and an identity that existed independent of anyone else's needs. Somehow, in the busy years of child-rearing and marriage tending, I'd forgotten that woman existed. But she was still there, buried under decades of other people's expectations. And she was tired of being ignored. The phone rang at 8:30, just as I was getting ready for bed. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID, and I watched it flash for 5 rings before the answering machine picked up. "Mom? I know you're there. Look, about the other day. Maybe I was out of line. You know, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just been crazy at work, and Sarah's been on my case about the kids' schedules, and... Anyway, can we talk? I really want to bring Emma and Jake by this weekend. They miss their grandma." Another carefully constructed message, full of justifications and deflections. He was sorry for being caught, not for being cruel. The mention of the children was strategic, designed to appeal to my emotions rather than my intelligence. I turned off the ringer and went to bed. The next morning brought clarity sharper than the autumn air streaming through my bedroom window. I had coffee and toast on the back porch, watching the leaves turn golden scarlet in the maple tree where David's bird feeder still hung. The cardinal was back, or perhaps it was a different one, I'd never been able to tell them apart. At 9 o'clock, I called Michael at his office. Mom. His relief was audible through the phone. I was wondering why you hadn't called back. Did you get my messages? I did, I said calmly. All of them. Great. So this weekend works for you? Sarah's making that casserole you like, and we thought we could, Michael, I said, cutting through his nervous chatter. I won't be available this weekend. Or next weekend. In fact, I think we need to take a break from these visits for a while. Silence. Then, what do you mean, take a break? Mom, you're not making sense. I'm making perfect sense. You told me I was old news. You made it clear that you see me as a burden, someone whose only value is what I can provide for you and your family. I'm simply choosing to stop providing it. Mom, come on. I was having a bad day. You know I didn't mean, you meant it, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Maybe you didn't plan to say it out loud, but you meant it. And that's fine, Michael. You're entitled to your feelings. But I'm entitled to mine too. This is crazy. You're my mother. You can't just cut me off because I said something you didn't like. I'm not cutting you off because I didn't like what you said. I'm protecting myself because I finally understood what you really think of me. There's a difference. What about Emma and Jake? You're going to punish them because you're mad at me? The emotional manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. The children will be fine. They have parents who love them, friends at school, and activities to keep them busy. They won't even notice I'm gone. That's not true, and you know it. Isn't it? When was the last time Emma called me? When did Jake last want to spend the night? Children adapt, Michael. They forget grandparents who become inconvenient much more easily than adults want to admit. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had an edge I'd never heard before, something ugly and desperate. You know what? Fine. If this is how you want to be, then maybe I was right. Maybe you are just a bitter old woman with nothing better to do than create drama. Maybe I am, I said peacefully. But I'm a bitter old woman who just changed her will, so perhaps you should think about that before you say anything else you might regret. The dial tone buzzed in my ear for several seconds before I realized he'd hung up. I sat there holding the phone, waiting for regret or sadness or some urge to call him back and apologize. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the profound relief of honesty. I'd finally stopped pretending that accepting cruelty was the same as demonstrating love. An hour later, Sarah called. Her voice was carefully controlled, artificially sweet in the way that meant she was furious but trying to hide it. Margaret, hi. Michael told me about your conversation this morning. I think there might be some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Sarah. Your husband has made his feelings about me quite clear, and I've made my decisions accordingly. But what about the children? They adore you. Emma was so excited about seeing you this weekend. She even made you a drawing at school. I closed my eyes, picturing Emma's earnest face bent over construction paper, carefully drawing whatever 7-year-olds draw for grandmothers they think they love. The children will be fine. They have parents to make them drawings and cookies and memories. They don't need a grandmother who's just old news. Michael feels terrible about saying that. He was stressed, and he took it out on you. You know how men are when they're worried about work. I know how Michael is, I said. And I know that stress doesn't excuse cruelty. If he feels terrible, he knows how to apologize properly. So far, all I've heard are excuses and justifications. Margaret, please. Don't do this. Family is family. We're supposed to forgive each other. Forgiveness doesn't require accepting continued disrespect, Sarah. I forgive Michael for showing me who he really is. But I don't have to pretend it didn't happen. What about Christmas? The children's birthdays? You can't just disappear from their lives. I can, actually. And I will, until someone in your family demonstrates that they value my presence for reasons other than free babysitting and homemade cookies. After I hung up, I felt the familiar ache of loss settle into my chest. But underneath it was something stronger, the satisfaction of finally standing up for myself after years of accepting whatever scraps of affection my family felt like offering. The doorbell rang that afternoon while I was reading in the living room. Through the window, I could see Michael's car in the driveway, Emma's small face pressed against the back window. My first instinct was to run to the door, to sweep my granddaughter into my arms and pretend the conversation with her father had never happened. But I stayed in my chair and kept reading until they drove away 20 minutes later. That evening, Joan called. "You sound different," she said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "Lighter, somehow." I told her about the will, about the conversations with Michael and Sarah, and about watching Emma's disappointed face through the car window and choosing not to answer the door. "How do you feel?" Joan asked when I finished. "Free," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "Sad, but free. Like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale." "Good for you," Joan said fiercely. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten you had a spine." I had forgotten for a while. It's amazing how gradually you can lose yourself in other people's needs. You give up little pieces of yourself so slowly that you don't notice until someone points out that there's nothing left. "So what now?" "Now I live," I said. "I volunteer more, I travel, and I read books that interest me instead of ones I think will make good conversation with people who don't really want to talk to me anyway. I find out who I am when I'm not trying to be someone's perfect mother or grandmother." That sounds wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. It is. But I'd rather be terrified and authentic than comfortable and invisible. After we hung up, I made myself dinner and ate it at the dining room table instead of standing at the kitchen counter. I used the good china David's mother had left me, the plates I'd been saving for special occasions that never seemed to come. If a quiet Tuesday evening in October wasn't special enough for the good china, what was I waiting for? The house felt different with Michael's anger hanging in the air. Not empty, exactly, but expectant, like it was waiting to see what would happen next. I'd spent so many years defining myself through other people's needs that I'd forgotten what it felt like to make decisions based purely on my own desires. What did I want? The question felt foreign, almost dangerous. For decades, want had been a luxury I couldn't afford. There had been too much to do, too many people depending on me, and too many ways to fail at the fundamental job of holding a family together. But sitting there with David's mother's china and the last of the evening light streaming through the windows, I realized that maybe wanting things wasn't selfish. Maybe it was human. I wanted to travel. David and I had always planned to see Europe when he retired, but cancer had stolen that dream along with so many others. I wanted to take that cooking class at the community college, the one I'd looked at every semester for 5 years but never signed up for because weekday evenings were family time. I wanted to sleep late on Sundays and eat ice cream for breakfast and buy books without worrying whether they were practical or educational or age-appropriate. I wanted to discover what made me laugh, what made me cry, and what made me feel alive in ways that had nothing to do with being useful to anyone else. The phone rang 3 more times that evening, Michael, Sarah, then Michael again. I let them all go to voicemail and deleted the messages without listening. Whatever they had to say, it would be variations on the same theme, appeals to my guilt, reminders of my obligations, and promises of consideration that would evaporate the moment I proved I could be managed back into compliance. I'd heard it all before. I wasn't interested in hearing it again. Instead, I ran a hot bath and soaked until my fingers pruned, reading a mystery novel I'd picked up at the library's book sale. The protagonist was a woman in her 60s who'd started a new career as a private detective after her husband's death. Completely implausible, wonderfully entertaining, and refreshingly full of a character who refused to be dismissed because of her age. When I finally went to bed, I didn't set my alarm. For the first time in 40 years, I would wake up when my body was ready, not when someone else's schedule demanded it. I woke to sunlight and the sound of birds at the feeder, feeling more rested than I had in months. No one needed me to make breakfast or find lost shoes or mediate sibling disputes. No one required my emotional labor or expected me to manage their comfort at the expense of my own. The silence felt like a gift. I made coffee and toast and sat in David's chair by the window, watching the neighborhood come alive. Mrs. Patterson walked her ancient terrier past my house, moving slowly but purposefully. The Johanssons were already in their garden, working side by side with the easy rhythm of shared purpose. These were my people now, neighbors I'd known for years but never really seen because I'd been too busy managing family relationships that required constant maintenance and yielded diminishing returns. Perhaps it was time to introduce myself properly, to join the community that existed right outside my door. At 10 o'clock, I called the travel agency downtown and made an appointment to discuss a trip to Italy. At 11, I registered for the cooking class that starts next month. At noon, I called the literacy center and asked if they needed extra help during the day. I had time now, so much time. Each decision felt like a small revolution, a quiet rebellion against the idea that my life was over because my usefulness to others had ended. If I was old news to my son, then perhaps it was time to become breaking news to myself. The phone rang while I was making lunch. This time it was Emma's voice on the machine, small and confused. "Grandma? Daddy says you're mad at us. I made you a picture of a butterfly. It has purple wings like the ones in your garden. Can we come see you? I promise Jake won't touch your fancy books." I stood in the kitchen listening to my granddaughter's voice, feeling my heart crack open with the pure love I'd always felt for her. For a moment, I wavered. She was innocent in all this, caught between adults who'd failed to teach her that love required respect as well as affection. But I didn't pick up the phone. Because Emma needed to learn, early and clearly, that people have worth beyond what they can provide for others. She needed to see that dignity matters, that boundaries aren't cruelty, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your humanity. Someday, when she is older, I will explain it to her. I would tell her about the grandmother who loved her enough to demonstrate self-respect, who refused to model the kind of selfless devotion that slowly erases women until nothing remains but their usefulness to others. For now, though, Emma would have to learn that actions have consequences, even when the actions belong to her parents and the consequences affect the people she loves. 3 weeks passed in a strange new rhythm of days that belonged entirely to me. I volunteered at the literacy center 4 mornings a week, taught Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter to bake bread on Thursday afternoons, and spent my evenings reading books I chose purely because they interested me. The travel agent had presented me with several options for Italy, and I'd chosen a small group tour that focused on art and history rather than shopping and nightlife. 2 weeks in Florence and Rome, staying in family-run hotels and eating at restaurants recommended by locals rather than tour buses. "You'll love it," the agent assured me as I signed the papers. "The group is mostly women your age, professionals, widows, people ready for adventure." Adventure. When was the last time someone had associated that word with my life? When had anyone assumed I was ready for new experiences rather than just marking time until death? The cooking class was a revelation. 8 adults gathered in the community college kitchen every Tuesday evening, learning to make pasta from scratch and discovering that risotto required more patience than skill. My classmates ranged from college students to retirees, but age seemed irrelevant when we were all equally hopeless at keeping our cutting boards organized or remembering to taste for seasoning. "You're a natural," the instructor told me after I'd successfully made gnocchi that didn't dissolve in the boiling water. "Have you thought about taking the advanced class next semester?" I had thought about it. I'd thought about a lot of things I'd never allowed myself to consider before. Pottery classes and book clubs, and maybe even getting a small dog for company. Not because I was lonely, I was learning the difference between loneliness and solitude, but because I wanted to share my newly discovered contentment with something that would appreciate it. Michael called twice during those 3 weeks. I listened to his messages before deleting them, noting the progression from anger to guilt to something approaching genuine confusion. He couldn't understand how his words had triggered such a complete withdrawal from his life. He'd said cruel things before, they all had, and I'd always absorbed them, processed them, and found ways to forgive and move forward. But this time was different, and he couldn't figure out why. The difference was that I'd finally stopped believing I deserved cruelty simply because it came from someone I'd given birth to. I'd stopped accepting that family love was supposed to hurt, that sacrifice was its own reward, and that my needs were somehow less important than everyone else's. Sarah called once, her voice tight with frustration. The children are asking questions I don't know how to answer. Emma wants to know why Grandma doesn't love her anymore. How am I supposed to explain that their grandmother is having some kind of breakdown? I almost picked up the phone at that, almost let her reframe my self-respect as mental illness and my boundaries as a breakdown. But I didn't. Because I understood now that this was how it always worked. Women who refused to accept mistreatment were labeled as crazy, difficult, and unreasonable. It was easier than admitting that the mistreatment had been wrong in the first place. The fourth week brought unexpected validation. Diana from the Literacy Center called to tell me that the board had voted to name their new scholarship program after me. The Margaret Chin Scholarship for Adult Learners, she said, pride evident in her voice. Your donation is going to change lives, Margaret. We'll be able to help people not just learn to read but get their GEDs, maybe even start college. You've given them hope. They gave me purpose, I said, realizing as I spoke that it was true. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm making a difference that matters. You are. And we want to honor that at our annual dinner next month. Would you be willing to speak? Nothing long, just a few words about why literacy matters? I said yes without hesitation. When was the last time anyone had asked me to speak about something I cared about? When had my opinions been valued, my experience seen as worthy of sharing? That evening, I sat down to write my speech, thinking about Rosa and the 12 other adults I'd helped learn to read over the past 3 years. People who'd been dismissed, overlooked, and written off as hopeless. People who'd discovered, with patient support, that they were capable of more than anyone had imagined. People like me, I realized. People who'd been underestimated, whose potential had been buried under other people's assumptions about what they were worth. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son had called me old news, irrelevant, and past my usefulness. And in response, I'd discovered that my real story was just beginning. Halloween came and went without the usual ritual of buying candy for trick-or-treaters who never came. Our neighborhood was too upscale, too far from the apartments where children actually lived. Instead, I carved a pumpkin for myself, something simple and cheerful, and put it on the front porch next to the mums I'd planted in cheerful defiance of the coming winter. Mrs. Patterson stopped by that evening, ostensibly to compliment the pumpkin but really to satisfy her curiosity about why my family hadn't visited in a month. Everything all right, dear? She asked with the careful delicacy of someone fishing for gossip while maintaining plausible deniability. Everything's fine, I said, offering her tea and settling into the conversation I'd been expecting for weeks. My son and I have different ideas about family relationships. We're taking some time to sort that out. Different ideas? He thinks being related gives him the right to treat me with disrespect. I disagree. Mrs. Patterson sipped her tea thoughtfully. She was 82 and had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children, 2 of whom still called her regularly and 2 of whom had essentially disappeared from her life after their father's death 10 years ago. Family's complicated, she said finally. But respect isn't. Either people treat you with dignity, or they don't. Age doesn't mean you have to accept whatever crumbs they're willing to offer. That's exactly right, I said, feeling the validation of someone who understood from experience rather than theory. Good for you, then. It takes courage to stand up for yourself, especially when it's family doing the hurting. We talked for an hour about gardens and books and the small pleasures of lives lived fully despite disappointment. When she left, I felt less alone than I had since this whole thing started. Not because I needed her approval, but because it was nice to be seen and understood by someone who wasn't trying to manage or fix or change me. November brought the Literacy Center's annual dinner, and with it my first public speech in 30 years. I'd written and rewritten my remarks until they felt both personal and universal, specific enough to be meaningful but broad enough to resonate with an audience of donors and volunteers. The community center was full. 200 people gathered to celebrate the power of education and the possibility of second chances. I sat at the head table, wearing David's mother's pearl necklace and a blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel beautiful for something that mattered to me. When Diana introduced me, she spoke about my volunteer work, my generous donation, and my quiet dedication to students who'd been overlooked by traditional education. But mostly she talked about transformation, how helping others learn had helped me discover new aspects of myself. Margaret Chin proves that it's never too late to write a new chapter in your life, she said. And tonight, she's going to tell us why that matters. I walked to the podium with steady hands and a clear voice, looking out at faces that were genuinely interested in what I had to say. When was the last time that had happened? When had anyone listened to me speak about something I cared about without checking their phones or planning their response? 3 months ago, I began. Someone I loved told me I was old news. It wasn't the first cruel thing this person had said to me, but it was the first time I truly heard it. And in hearing it, I realized something important. I'd been agreeing with them. The room was completely quiet, 200 people listening to a woman they'd probably dismissed as a typical volunteer grandmother before I opened my mouth. I'd been living like my story was over, like my value was tied entirely to what I could do for other people. I'd forgotten that I was still learning, still growing, still capable of surprise, both for others and for myself. I talked about Rosa, about the moment her face lit up when she read her first complete book. I talked about the courage it takes to admit you don't know something, the patience required to learn new skills, and the joy of discovery that has nothing to do with age or circumstance. Literacy isn't just about reading words on a page, I said. It's about reading your own life clearly enough to know what you deserve, what you're worth, and what story you want to tell. And sometimes, that means having the courage to edit out the people who insist your story is already over. The applause when I finished was warm and sustained, but more importantly, people came up to me afterward to share their own stories of late-life reinvention, of boundaries set and dignity reclaimed. I wasn't alone in this journey. I was part of a community of people who'd refused to accept other people's limitations on their lives. Diana hugged me as the evening wound down. That was beautiful, Margaret. You made everyone in this room see themselves differently. They made me see myself differently first, I said. Teaching literacy has been as much about learning to read my own worth as anything else. Driving home that night, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness, exactly, that seemed too light a word for something so deep and settled. Satisfaction, maybe. The quiet pleasure of a life being lived with intention rather than just endured. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, but it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful, full of possibility, and ready for whatever came next. Inside, there were 3 messages on my answering machine. The first was from Joan, who'd driven down for the dinner and wanted to tell me how proud she felt watching me speak. The second was from my cooking class instructor, inviting me to help teach a community workshop on bread making. The third was from Michael. Mom. His voice sounded different, smaller, less certain. I saw the article about the Literacy Center dinner in the paper. About your speech and the scholarship. I didn't know you were doing all that. I guess I didn't know a lot of things about you. A long pause, filled with what sounded like genuine confusion. I've been thinking about what you said. About the will, about respect. Maybe we could talk? Not about the money, about us. About what I said that day. I think I need to understand some things I don't understand. Another pause, longer this time. Emma keeps asking when she can see you. I keep telling her soon, but I don't know if that's true anymore. I don't know how to fix this, Mom. I don't even know if you want me to. The message ended with the click of a phone being hung up hesitantly, as if he'd wanted to say more but hadn't known how. I stood in my kitchen listening to the silence that followed, feeling something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, that would take time and demonstrated change rather than words. But perhaps it was the beginning of possibility, the first crack in a wall that had seemed impermeable just hours before. Michael's confusion felt genuine in a way his previous calls had not. For the first time, he seemed to be questioning his own assumptions rather than trying to manage mine. He'd seen me in the newspaper, recognized a version of his mother he didn't know existed, and it had forced him to reconsider what he thought he knew about my life. That was a start. Not enough, but a start. I saved the message instead of deleting it, though I didn't call back. Whatever conversation we eventually had would need to happen on my terms, in my time, when I was confident that respect had been genuinely learned rather than temporarily performed. For now, it was enough to know that the possibility existed. December brought the first snow, and with it a strange kind of peace. The house felt cozy rather than empty, wrapped in winter quiet and filled with the gentle sounds of a life being lived with attention. I read by the fire in the evenings, cooked elaborate meals for myself, and discovered the pleasure of solitude chosen rather than endured. The Italy trip was planned for February, and I'd started learning basic Italian phrases from a CD the travel agent had recommended. Dove il bagno? And quanto costa? Felt exotic on my tongue, syllables from a life I'd never imagined living. I'd also signed up for pottery classes starting in January, inspired by a neighbor's beautiful garden sculptures and my own desire to create something with my hands. At 63, I was learning that it wasn't too late to discover new talents, new interests, and new versions of myself. The cooking classes had ended with a group dinner where we prepared a 4-course meal and invited family members to join us. I'd hesitated over the invitation, then asked Joan to drive down for the evening. Watching her enjoy food I'd prepared from scratch and seeing her pride in my newfound skills reminded me that family could be chosen as well as inherited. Michael called twice more in December, each message a little longer, a little less certain. He'd started seeing a counselor, he said, trying to understand why his marriage was struggling and why he felt angry so much of the time. He was beginning to recognize patterns in how he treated people, ways of thinking he'd inherited without questioning. I think I've been taking my stress out on the people who couldn't fight back, he said in the most recent message. Sarah, the kids, you. People who loved me enough to absorb whatever I needed to dump on them. That's not fair. That's not who I want to be. I listened to these messages with interest but not urgency. Change was possible, but it was also slow, and I'd learned not to mistake intentions for actions or promises for permanent transformation. If Michael was genuinely committed to becoming a better person, that was wonderful. But it wasn't my job to guide or support or witness that transformation unless and until he'd proven he could sustain it. My life no longer revolved around managing other people's emotional growth. I had my own growing to do. Christmas Eve found me at the Literacy Center's holiday party, surrounded by students and tutors and board members who'd become, over the past few months, something like a chosen family. Rosa was there with her teenage daughter, both of them glowing with the news that Rosa had passed her GED exam and been accepted to community college for the spring semester. I never thought I'd be smart enough for college, she told me over punch and homemade cookies. But you made me believe I could learn anything if I was patient with myself. You taught me the same thing, I said, realizing as I spoke that it was true. Rosa's courage in facing her illiteracy had inspired my own courage in facing the ways I'd allowed myself to be diminished. At midnight, I stood in my kitchen drinking tea and looking out at the snow-covered garden where David's bird feeder swayed gently in the winter wind. The cardinal was back, or perhaps it had never left, a flash of red against the white landscape, beautiful and self-contained and perfectly sufficient unto itself. I thought about the year that was ending, about the woman I'd been 12 months ago, and the woman I was becoming. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but it had been profound. I'd learned to read my own life with the same attention I brought to teaching others, recognizing the stories I'd been telling myself and choosing which ones still served me. The phone rang at 12:15, startling me from my reverie. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID, and for the first time in 2 months, I answered. "Mom?" His voice was thick with something, tears, maybe, or wine, or just the weight of words he'd been carrying too long. "Hello, Michael. I wasn't sure you'd pick up." I wasn't sure I would either. A long pause, filled with the sound of snow against the windows and two people trying to find their way back to each other across a distance that felt both immense and surprisingly small. I wanted to call and say. To say I'm sorry. Really sorry. Not because I want something or because Sarah made me, but because I'd been thinking about what you said, and you were right. I was treating you like you didn't matter, like your feelings didn't count just because you're my mother and you're supposed to love me no matter what. You were, I agreed calmly. That's not who I want to be. That's not the man Dad raised me to be. No, it isn't. Another pause, shorter this time. Can we try again? Not to go back to how things were, but to build something better? I know I hurt you, and I know saying sorry doesn't fix that, but I want to earn your trust back if you'll let me. I thought about the months since he'd called me old news, about the life I'd built in the spaces cruelty had opened up. I thought about Rosa learning to read at 43, about my own journey back to selfhood, and about the difference between forgiving someone and allowing them back into your life. We can try, I said finally. But it will have to be different this time, Michael. I won't go back to being someone who exists primarily to serve your convenience. I have a life now that belongs to me, and any relationship we build will have to respect that. I understand, he said, and something in his voice suggested he might actually mean it. Do you? Because this isn't a negotiation. I'm not asking for your permission to have boundaries. I'm telling you what my conditions are for moving forward. What are they? I thought about the question I'd been asking myself for months. What did I want? Not what I thought I should want, or what would be easiest, or what would make other people happy. What did I actually want from a relationship with my son? I want to be treated like a person whose opinions matter, whose time has value, whose feelings deserve consideration. I want conversations instead of lectures, respect instead of management. I want you to be interested in my life as something other than a source of services for yours. That sounds fair. It sounds like the bare minimum of human decency, I said, not unkindly but clearly. But it's more than I was getting before. I know. And I'm going to do better. I promise. Promises are easy, Michael. What matters is consistent action over time. I'm willing to see what you do with that opportunity, but I won't pretend that wanting to change is the same as actually changing. We talked for another 20 minutes, carefully and tentatively, like people learning a new language. He told me about the counseling, about the ways he was trying to be more present with his own children, and about the apology he owed Sarah for taking his professional stress out on their marriage. I told him about Italy, about the pottery classes, about the scholarship fund, and about the speech I'd given. He listened with what sounded like genuine interest, asking questions that suggested he was seeing me as a person with her own desires and accomplishments rather than just his mother. When we hung up, I felt cautiously hopeful. Not because I believed change was easy or permanent, but because I was no longer afraid of losing something I couldn't live without. I'd learned to build a full life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or participation. If Michael could find his way back to being someone worthy of inclusion in that life, wonderful. If not, I would be fine either way. The snow continued falling as I got ready for bed, covering the world in clean silence. Tomorrow would be Christmas, and for the first time in years, I was looking forward to it. Not because I expected gifts or gatherings or any of the traditional markers of holiday joy, but because I was finally comfortable with my own company, content with choices that reflected my actual values rather than other people's expectations. I'd learned to read my own story clearly, to edit out the characters who diminished rather than enriched the narrative. And in doing so, I'd discovered that the best chapters might still be ahead of me, waiting to be written by a woman who finally understood her own worth. Spring came early that year, arriving in a rush of crocuses and cherry blossoms that seemed to mirror my own sense of renewal. The Italy trip had been everything I'd hoped: art and architecture and conversation with women who'd also discovered that life after 60 could be full of surprise and adventure. I'd returned with a suitcase full of pottery from local artisans and a head full of ideas for my own ceramic work. The classes had revealed an unexpected talent for sculpture, and I'd begun creating pieces that captured the small moments of beauty I noticed in my daily life: the curve of a bird's wing, the texture of tree bark, the way light fell across my kitchen table in the early morning. Michael had been true to his word, more or less. We spoke every few weeks, conversations that felt increasingly natural as he learned to ask about my life rather than just report on his own. He'd brought the children by twice, visits that were shorter than the old marathon sessions but more genuinely connected. Emma had admired my pottery with the serious attention children reserve for things they recognize as important to the adults they love. The Literacy Center had asked me to join their board of directors, and I'd accepted with the same sense of purpose I'd once brought to raising children and managing a household. But this time, the energy I invested came back to me multiplied rather than depleted, feeding something in me that had been hungry for years without my realizing it. One warm afternoon in May, I was in the garden planting the vegetables David and I had always talked about growing when Joan called with news that made me sit down hard on the edge of the raised bed I'd been working on. "Margaret, honey, I have something to tell you. I'm selling the house." Joan's house was 3 hours away in the town where we'd grown up, the place she'd returned to after her husband's death 15 years ago. She'd lived alone there ever since, stubbornly independent despite increasing frailty and a series of small strokes that worried everyone who loved her. "Are you all right? Has something happened?" "Nothing dramatic," she said with the careful cheerfulness of someone delivering news they know will be received as bad. "Just the usual indignities of aging. The stairs are getting harder, the garden's too much work, and I spend too much time talking to the television for it to be entirely healthy." "Where will you go?" "Well, that's what I wanted to discuss with you. There's a senior community here that's quite nice, independent living with support services available as needed. But they also have a location in your area, and I was wondering, would you like a neighbor?" The idea hit me like warm water, flooding spaces I hadn't realized were still cold. Joan and I had been each other's closest confidants since childhood, but geography and busy lives had kept us from the kind of daily friendship we'd shared as girls. "You want to move here?" "I want to be near the person who matters most to me," Joan said simply. "We're not getting any younger, sweetheart, and I'd rather spend whatever time I have left with someone who actually enjoys my company." We spent the next hour discussing practicalities, the timeline for her move, the housing options available, and the possibility of finding something that would allow us to be close without crowding each other. By the time we hung up, I was grinning like a teenager making plans with her best friend. That evening, Michael called for our weekly conversation. When I told him about Joan's decision, he was quiet for a long moment. "That sounds really nice, Mom. I'm glad you'll have someone close by." "Is that your way of saying you're worried about me living alone?" "Maybe a little. Not because I think you can't take care of yourself, but because everyone deserves to have people who love them nearby." It was exactly the right thing to say, and I told him so. 6 months ago, he would have framed Joan's move as a solution to his worry about my independence, positioning himself as the concerned son managing his mother's care. Now he was able to see it as what it actually was: two people choosing to share their lives because it would bring them both joy. "I've been thinking," he said as our conversation wound down, "about what you said at Christmas, about wanting to be treated like a person whose opinions matter. I realized I don't actually know very much about what you think about things. Like, real things. Politics and books and what you want to do with the rest of your life." "You could ask," I suggested gently. "I am asking, what do you want to do with the rest of your life?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was difficult but because it was the first time anyone had asked it without an agenda attached. Michael genuinely wanted to know, not so he could approve or disapprove or offer management strategies, but because he was curious about me as a person. I want to travel more, I said, thinking out loud. Europe was wonderful, but there's so much else to see. I want to get better at pottery, maybe good enough to sell pieces at the craft fair. I want to learn to speak Italian properly instead of just tourist phrases. I want to see Emma and Jake grow up, but as their grandmother, not their babysitter. That all sounds amazing. What about you? What do you want to do with the rest of your life? It was his turn to be caught off guard, and I realized with a pang of recognition that no one had asked him that question either. We'd all been so focused on what he was supposed to do, succeed at work, provide for his family, manage his responsibilities, that we'd forgotten to wonder what he actually wanted. I don't know, he said finally. I guess I'd been so busy doing what I thought I was supposed to do that I never really thought about what I wanted to do. It's never too late to start thinking about it. Is that what you did? Started thinking about what you wanted? Yes, though it took someone calling me old news to shock me into it. I'm sorry about that. Not just because it hurt you, but because it wasn't true. You're not old news, Mom. You're like breaking news. New stuff happening all the time that I was too self-absorbed to notice. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk of my garden, listening to the evening chorus of birds and feeling grateful for the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who'd stood in her kitchen 8 months ago, absorbing cruelty because she'd forgotten she had other options, felt like someone I'd known in another lifetime. This version of myself was stronger, clearer, and more interested in her own story than in managing other people's opinions of it. This woman had learned to read her own worth accurately, to edit out relationships that diminished rather than enriched her narrative, and to trust that new chapters were always possible if you had the courage to turn the page. The cardinal was at the feeder again, or maybe it was a different one. I'd given up trying to tell them apart. What mattered wasn't whether it was the same bird, but that birds kept coming, drawn by the simple offering of seeds scattered with no expectation of return. Like kindness, I thought. Like respect. Like love, when it was freely given rather than demanded or earned through endless service. Joan moved to town in July, settling into a charming apartment in the senior community just 10 minutes from my house. We fell back into the rhythm of daily friendship as easily as if we'd never been apart, sharing meals and books and the small observations that make life rich when you have someone who genuinely wants to hear them. She was with me the day the letter arrived from the lawyer, informing me that my new will had been officially filed and all previous versions were void. The document that had once left everything to Michael now directed my estate toward people and causes that honored the woman I'd become rather than the one I'd been expected to remain. Any regrets? Joan asked as I folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. None, I said, and meant it completely. 6 months later, on a February afternoon when the light was just beginning to hint at spring, Emma called me directly for the first time. Not through her father's phone, not with prompting from Sarah, but on her own initiative because she had something she wanted to tell me. Grandma, guess what? I'm learning to read chapter books now, and Dad said you help people learn to read, and I was wondering if maybe you could come to my school and read with my class. I would love that, sweetheart. Really? Because some kids in my class have grandmas who do that, and I wanted mine to do it too, but I wasn't sure if you would want to. I absolutely want to. When would you like me to come? We made plans for the following week, Emma chattering excitedly about the book she'd chosen and the friends she wanted me to meet. When we hung up, I realized that this was what I'd been hoping for all along, not the desperate gratitude of people who needed my services, but the simple pleasure of someone who enjoyed my company. That evening, as I prepared for bed in the house that had become truly mine, I thought about the story I would tell if someone asked me to sum up these past months. It wouldn't be a story about revenge or even justice. It would be a story about reading, learning to read my own life clearly enough to edit out the parts that no longer served me and to write new chapters filled with people who saw my worth. It would be a story about discovering that old news can become breaking news with the simple decision to stop accepting other people's limitations on your life. About learning that love without respect is just another form of exploitation, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be diminished. Most of all, it would be a story about the quiet revolution that happens when a woman finally understands that her value doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition of it, that she can be complete, purposeful, and deeply loved just as she is. The cardinal was silent in the winter darkness, but I knew it would return with the dawn, as persistent and self-contained as hope itself. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new chances to choose dignity over convenience and authentic connection over familiar dysfunction. I had learned to read my own story at last, and the best chapters were still being written.